Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Inglês no Rádio. Today we have a very special guest, Amanda. Amanda is actually one of Alexia's Portuguese students. So she's learning Portuguese with Alexia, and she speaks really well. She has a very interesting story, and I'm really excited to have you on the show. Welcome, Amanda.
Hey, Foster. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be on the show, and I'm a huge fan of Inglês no Crew, so I'm excited to be able to record an episode with you.
Yeah, so it's very interesting that I think you are probably the only American native English speaker that is a big fan of a podcast designed for Brazilian Portuguese speakers. And I'm not sure if all of our listeners know this, but we do have two podcasts. We have Inglês no Rádio, which is teaching English to Brazilians, and we have Carioca Connection, which is teaching Brazilian Portuguese to English speakers or anyone who wants to learn Brazilian Portuguese. And you're a big fan of both, which is really interesting to me.
Yeah, so I started listening to Carioca Connection because I found out about it, I think through Spotify. I was taking classes on italki and was just kind of looking for just some audio, something that I could kind of listen to and improve my listening skills. And then through listening to that podcast, I realized that you guys had Inglês no Crew Rádio, and so I started listening to that, and because I was really curious kind of what it would be like from the other side, and listening to kind of like the content or things that people would be interested in learning English from the Portuguese side. And so I started listening to that, and obviously my comprehension of Inglês no Crew is a lot better because I'm a native English speaker, but I think you guys cover a lot of lessons and things that are really helpful for me learning Portuguese. Just a lot of the different language rules and understanding the sounds that exist in one language or another language, and the different kind of tricks or things to remember words and vocabulary. And so, and listening to both podcasts, I found it really beneficial, and they kind of complement each other. So I listen to pretty much all the episodes, and I love it. And it's also kind of fun to hear, things that Alexia is curious about, or things that, I kind of take for granted and think are normal, and then realize, oh, maybe that is kind of different for someone else, someone who's not from the United States. So it gives me a lot to think about.
Yeah, that's really cool. Alexia and I were actually in the supermarket yesterday, and she was taking pictures of all the prices of different kinds of cookies, like Oreos and stuff. I was like, "What are you doing?" "What are you doing?" And she's like, "Oh, people will love this." And surely enough, on Instagram, like people are like, "Oh my God, Oreos are so cheap there."
Yeah, like I would literally never think about, like, I don't really eat Oreos because they're just kind of, I don't know, it's just like a staple thing here. Like I would never think about that.
Yeah, but I do think it is really interesting that when you are listening to us speak English, and normally we are trying to address like common problems that Brazilians have when learning English, the
Mhm.
same problems that Brazilians will have learning English that you probably never think about, that will probably give you a lot of insight into, if Brazilians are having difficulties with this in English, then the reverse will also work, that I will probably struggle with that in Portuguese.
Yeah, definitely. And there's just so many things that kind of go back and forth. And I think that and your background in language learning, just in general, I think the language learning lessons are pretty universal in terms of, the best way to learn is to start speaking right away and have as many conversations as you can. And even when I went to Brazil, like you're kind of in my head the whole time, like, okay, gotta have these conversations. Like I gotta try to speak more. And just like for your listeners, just realize like the same awkwardness kind of goes back and forth. Like when I went, like I was terrified of speaking, and I went there feeling like pretty confident, but when I got there and heard people speaking on the street, I was like, oh my God, I can't understand anything. Like, this is overwhelming. I don't know what's going on. And it really gave me some perspective in understanding how people feel when they come to the United States, and to have just a lot more respect for the people that are learning languages, because it is really scary, and it is really uncomfortable when you can kind of default to your normal language, your native language. And so, like, being in Los Angeles, I see tourists every day, and there's a lot of people that come here and don't speak English, and yeah, so it kind of helps me sympathize with them and what they're going through, and really helping them to try to speak English instead of instead of just judging them, being like, oh, you're coming here and without knowing anything.
Yeah. If someone has already learned another language, those are always the best people to learn with because they understand the struggle. The struggle is real. And
Yeah, definitely.
yeah. So, Amanda, you speak Portuguese quite well, and you've traveled to Brazil. But could you tell me just a little bit of your background? Like, why did you decide to learn Portuguese? Did it start with Brazilian culture? Did it start with just an interest in the language?
Yeah, I think so. When I was in college, I ended up meeting a group of Brazilians, and since then, I've always just been really fascinated and drawn to Brazilian culture and music and the language itself. And so Portuguese was always something that I always kind of wanted to learn uh, for, I don't know, maybe the last 10 years. So when I started, I did probably the most passive form of learning, which is trying to use the language apps. So using Duolingo or using Babbel, and those are like, I mean, it's pretty safe to say that that was kind of a waste of time, because I honestly can't remember a single thing that I actually learned.
Yes.
And in
She
general,
said it too. Apps are ineffective.
yeah, because it's something where you can sit and do it, when you're on the couch and you're not really thinking about it. And you think that you're just like, oh, I'm learning all this stuff and I'm kind of doing it without thinking. But it doesn't stick. And even using things like Memrise, where it's kind of flashcards and vocabulary, the thing that I found that works best for me is just old school flashcards, and being able to kind of write down words that, like, I need to know, because with the language apps you end up learning a lot of words that you'll never really use again. And so in general, like, after using Duolingo for a year, I could say that I probably didn't retain anything from it. And then a couple years ago, I learned about these language classes that were happening locally in Los Angeles. And so I signed up for them, and it was this one Brazilian woman teaching different levels of Portuguese to groups of 3 or like maybe 3 to 8 people. And so I signed up for 2 semesters of that. So I did that for probably 6 months. And it was really just preliminary, like, hi, how are you? My name is Amanda. And even that, it was taught in a really traditional setting. We had, a book, and we had vocabulary to learn, and we had kind of a lesson plan. But even then, a majority of the class was in English, and maybe only, 25% in Portuguese, when we were kind of trying to speak to each other, the English speakers trying to speak to each other in Portuguese. And I felt like that class, in general, it was a lot of English, but also speaking to non-native speakers, like, it doesn't really help you as much, because they don't really know if you're wrong or if you're saying something incorrectly. And so I felt like even that, I left the class not feeling confident at all in being able to have a conversation. And then when that class ended, I heard about italki, so I signed up for that, and then just started doing these 1-hour sessions once a week. And it was completely different. Instead of a majority of it being in English, it was pretty much all in Portuguese, with a couple English translations here or there. But I ended up like just stumbling my way through conversations, 1 hour a week. And I was amazed by the amount of progress I was able to make. And just speaking, I felt so much more comfortable speaking and so much more confident. And every week I was getting better and better and better. And I can like literally just see the improvement week to week. And whereas before I could barely understand anything, my listening was improving a lot, my comprehension, like my confidence. And then so that's when I started to use Karaoke Connection as kind of a lesson plan. You guys would come out with a new episode every week, and then I would talk to my teacher about it, and he would be like, so, what did the podcast talk about this week? And be like, oh, we're talking about neighborhoods in Rio. And then so we kind of go and talk about neighborhoods in Rio and use your conversations as kind of the base of our lesson plan that week. And then with italki, I would kind of just make flashcards of whatever words I would stumble on or any new vocabulary that I needed in our day-to-day conversation. And then I found out Alexia was also an italki teacher. So I started taking classes with her, and then that's kind of where I am today. And so now in my kind of weekly Portuguese schedule, I try to do one italki class, and the other days I'll talk to just language partners of other people that I've met who are learning English. So we'll do 30 minutes in English, 30 minutes in Portuguese, and it's been really fun. And it's also been just kind of an important part of my schedule. It helps me to disconnect from work. It helps me to meet new people. And I think kind of talking to someone on a week-to-week basis, I think it kind of plays a lot into your mental health and just having someone to kind of check in on, and in terms of like, how am I feeling this week? So I think that it's become a really important part of my life and something that goes beyond learning a new language.
Yeah, I think, okay, you said so many things that I just totally agree with on so many different levels. First, I think the aspect of language learning kind of as therapy or mental health, like something just to keep your mental health in check, is an amazing, amazing tool. We talk about mental health a lot on the show. I'm very open about me just being a super anxious person, and kind of having like a language partner or a teacher or tutor that you can talk to in a very isolated environment. It really is a form of therapy for me. And it's like so far removed from my normal life. I love that aspect of language learning. I think it's really important that you pointed that out.
And I think too that even so, when you're sitting there and you're like just really concentrating on listening, and you're really concentrated on thinking, okay, how can I say this? Like, how can I convey these feelings? I think that you're being present in the true sense. Like you're looking at someone and you're communicating, and in that moment, you can't really think about anything else. Like, I'm not thinking about work. I'm not thinking about my to-do list or what I have to do, after the session ends. And I think that, it's almost a form of meditation in a way, where you're just like, I'm really truly present in this moment. And I think that that's a huge benefit in itself.
Absolutely. I think of it as like meditation for people that are not good at meditating, at least in my case.
Definitely.
And I would like to point out that you are an incredibly busy person. You are always doing things. We're talking right now, and it's like 7 a.m. your time, and you still manage to fit in a pretty impressive language learning schedule. And I think that's really beneficial, because a lot of people after a long day of work, they just kind of want to like sit on the couch and watch TV, but those like thoughts of work are still kind of ruminating in your head. But if you finish work and you're talking to some Brazilian that you don't really know that well, you're pretty focused on that and not all of the things that happen during your day.
Yeah, exactly. So I try to schedule the classes or the conversations at 5 p.m. because I'm kind of a workaholic. So if I don't have anything to signal the end of my day, I'll be like, okay, well, I can catch up on this, or I can kind of get this stuff done and be ahead for tomorrow.
Same.
But when I'm like, okay, I need to get all of this stuff done by 5, because I have to talk to this person at 5, then I'll crank away the day and try and get that stuff done. And then 5 o'clock comes around, I have, the session. And then after we're done talking, I'm completely disconnected from work. And I'm like, okay, I'm ready to go home now. I can go home and I can go on with my day, and I don't need to worry about work until tomorrow. So it's become a part of my routine, and it really helps me disconnect from the anxieties around working.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's amazing. You also touched on two things that I cannot let go. First, you started, as most people do, with language learning apps like Duolingo, Babbel. Babbel, perhaps a little bit better, but we talk a lot of shit about Duolingo on this podcast, and I have no shame in doing that. But then you even moved to group sessions where you said a lot of it was in English. And when you were speaking Portuguese, most of the time you were speaking with other native English speakers.
Hmm.
I know all Brazilians can relate to that. Just saying, like, hello, how are you to other Brazilians. And in my mind, the way I see it is like the goal is pretty obvious. You want to talk to Brazilians. You're interested in Brazilian culture. You want to connect with the culture and the people. So the best way to do that is to talk to the people. And there are all of these things to just kind of move you away from that goal. And it just seems really silly to me, not just to dive straight into it, you know?
Yeah. And obviously the best way to do it is just to practice the thing that you're trying to do. So if you're trying to talk to people, then talking is the best thing that you can do for it. And I think the Portuguese that I've learned, I feel like it's a little bit backwards in terms of traditional learning, but it's also, I feel like it's just more natural because I'm learning to talk about the things that I normally talk about. Like, I know how to talk about my work. I could talk about what I did this weekend. I could talk about what my plans are for the next couple weeks and traveling. And I don't need to know the vocabulary of what's at the grocery store, and so I'll learn those things when I need to learn them. But I think that I'm using and learning phrases and words that are practical to be able to talk about my life. And
Absolutely. I don't think the way that you're learning is backwards. I think the traditional learning method is backwards.
yeah,
Like if you do not eat cabbage, you should not learn how to say cabbage in week 2 of your Portuguese class, you know?
yeah, exactly. And maybe my spelling isn't the best. Maybe I, my grammar is not the best, or I mess up on different conjugations, or learning what's feminine, what's masculine, is always a challenge. But I'd rather stumble through a sentence than sit there and worry about, like, oh my God, what's the gender of this noun? And so it's like, no, just get it out there, and maybe you'll mess up. You probably will, but chances are whoever you're talking to can figure out what you're trying to say.
Absolutely. And I think the small nuances of like grammar and syntax, those come a lot more naturally and will come a lot faster once you reach a high conversational level. Then eventually you don't have to think about like, oh, what is the gender of this noun? You've just heard yourself make that mistake enough times where
Mhm.
you automatically know it. So I think it's a win-win all the way around. Cool.